Good day, everyone. This is your captain speaking. Today, we are taking a look at a man who, despite the dearth of information about his life, has inspired a legend that lives on to this very day, some 2,000 years later. So strap on your sandals and sharpen your sword, because today, we're taking a look at the man known as Spartacus to discover the man behind the myth. Spartacus was born in 103 BC, near the Strymon River in what is today Bulgaria. At the time, the land was part of a region known as Thrace. There was not a single unified Thracian people. They were a loose conglomerate of nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes. The tribe that Spartacus was possibly born into was known as the Mighty, a tribe that remained almost entirely independent of the other Thracian tribes. There is next to nothing known of Spartacus's early life. What little we do know is that he was a Thracian. He was possibly of the Mighty or some other nomadic tribe. He had a wife who was a prophetess or seer, and he fought for Rome as a mercenary. During his time fighting for Rome, he deserted the army and was caught and imprisoned, after which time he was taken to Rome and sold into slavery. All of this before he was 30 years old. After his capture, he was sold at some point to a lanista named Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Vatia, also known more commonly as Lentulus Batiatus, who trained him in the gladiatorial arts at his ludus near Capua. He trained in the style of the Murmillo. Murmillo were heavy fighters, carrying a large scutum shield and a gladius. Their armor consisted of a leather belt decorated with metal, known as a baltius, an arm guard that covered the entirety of the sword arm with segmented or scaled metal plates, known as a manica, a large bronze helmet with a grilled face visor known as a cassis Christa, and metal shin armor known as ochrea, which were worn over thick paddings known as fasciae. There is nothing known about his performance as a gladiator, as far as I could find, that is not linked to Hollywood or other modern representations. In 73 BC, at roughly the age of 30, Spartacus and the other gladiators of the House of Vatia staged an uprising. Among the other gladiators involved in the uprising, of which there were roughly 70, were the Gaul known as Crixus, the Celt known as Gannicus, a second Gaul named Castus, and a third Gaul named Anamaeus. Together, these slaves armed themselves with kitchen utensils and fought their way out of the ludus, seizing several wagons worth of gladiatorial weapons and armor as they escaped. They then had to defeat a contingent of soldiers sent to capture them, which they did. After this small victory, they set about pillaging the villas around Capua, freeing slaves and stealing food and supplies as they went. 3 leaders were selected from among the slaves to lead them in their revolt: Spartacus, Crixus, and Anamaeus, though historians have to wonder whether the slaves were united together under their leaders or if they were more divided, as it is possible that Roman biases in recording the events of the Third Servile War may have colored their commentary of the hierarchy within the slave army. It had taken a good bit of time before Rome could muster a proper response to the uprising. No Roman legions were stationed in or operating within the region at the time. For context, at the start of the Third Servile War, the Roman legions were occupied by a rebellion in Hispania, led by the Roman general and statesman Quintus Sertorius, and by the Third Mithridatic War. These military distractions, and the fact that Rome did not see Spartacus and his slave rebellion as a pressing matter, allowed Spartacus and his growing band of followers to set themselves up at Mount Vesuvius, as Rome dispatched the praetor Gaius Claudius Glaber and a militia of roughly 3,000 men to bring them to heel. Glaber surrounded the volcano, hoping to starve Spartacus and his followers out. However, Spartacus and his men descended the steep cliffs of Vesuvius using ropes made from vines and attacked the Roman camp from the rear, killing most of the militia, leading to their first major victory at the Battle of Mount Vesuvius. Following the defeat of Glaber, Rome sent Praetor Publius Verinius, who divided his army between his subordinates Furius and Cassinius. This army was also defeated by Spartacus, leading to the death of Cassinius and the capture of the army's weapons and supplies. As word of Spartacus's victory spread, many slaves and even local shepherds and herdsmen flocked to his side, swelling the numbers of his army from the original 70 to over 70,000. In the winter of 73 BC, the slave army trained their new recruits and raided the cities of Nola, Nuceria, Thurii, and Metapontum. At some point after this, Anamaeus disappears from the historical record, likely dying in battle. Spartacus's next opponents would come in the form of a pair of consular legions, led by Lucius Gellius and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus. At first, the consular legions fared far better against Spartacus's slave army than the previous legions had. Near Mount Garganus, Gellius engaged an army of 30,000 slaves led by Crixus. The battle ended in defeat for the rebels, and Crixus, as well as roughly 20,000 of his men, were killed. This meant that only one of the original 3 leaders of the uprising remained, Spartacus himself. It is at this point that the classical sources begin to differ greatly. The first account, detailed by Appianus Alexandrinus, writing over 100 years after the Third Servile War ended, is as follows. After the defeat of Crixus at Mount Garganus, Gellius set off in pursuit of Spartacus and the main Servile army, who had camped near Gallia Cisalpina. The legion under Lentulus moved to trap Spartacus between them. Spartacus engaged Lentulus and defeated his army, then turned and did the same to Gellius, splintering the Roman legions and forcing them into a disorganized retreat. In this account, after these battles, Spartacus forced 300 captured Romans to engage in gladiatorial combat to the death as vengeance for the death of Crixus. Meanwhile, the consuls fled toward Rome to regroup. Spartacus and his army, now over 120,000 strong, marched north after them and defeated them again at the Battle of Picenum. At this point in the account, Appianus implies that Spartacus had intended to push on and attack Rome itself, but changed his mind as he did not believe his forces ready for such a battle. Instead, he turned southward again and captured the city of Thurii. From this new base, they raided the surrounding countryside and traded their spoils to merchants and traders for iron and bronze in order to forge new weapons and armor. Appianus also states that during this time, Spartacus and his followers defeated several more Roman armies who had tried to attack them. The second account of events comes from Plutarch, also writing long after the end of the Third Servile War. His version of events is as follows. After the defeat of Crixus at Mount Garganus, Spartacus engaged the army under Lentulus and defeated it, seizing their weapons and supplies before pushing into what is now northern Italy. After this defeat, both consuls were relieved of their commands and recalled to Rome. Plutarch does not mention a fight against Gellius, nor the Battle of Picenum. Next, Spartacus marched towards the region of Mutina, known today as Modena, where he engaged a force of 10,000 led by the consul Gaius Cassius Longinius. This would result in yet another victory for Spartacus. At this point, the account of Plutarch jumps ahead to the moment when the legions led by Marcus Crassus joined the fray, at which point Spartacus and his followers were back in southern Italy, with no explanation for why they reversed course. This is the point where both sources converge once more. In 71 BC, Marcus Licinius Crassus, a Roman general and statesman known as the richest man in Rome, is approached to lead the war against Spartacus. In 82 BC, he'd served as a field commander under Lucius Cornelius Sulla during Sulla's civil war, after which Sulla declared himself dictator of Rome. Crassus was made praetor and given 6 legions to command, plus the remains of the consular legions formerly under the commands of Gellius and Lentulus. This put his numbers anywhere between 32,000 and 48,000 men. Crassus' command of his legions was one of harsh, stern, and even brutal leadership. At one point, he revived the abandoned practice of decimation as a punishment for his units. For context, decimation, known in Latin as decimatio, stems from the Latin word decum, meaning 10. In this practice, every 10th man in a cohort is executed by the other members of that cohort. It is uncertain at which point in the war Crassus ordered the decimation, whether it was ordered as punishment for the two consular legions for their cowardice and failure against Spartacus at Picenum, or if he ordered it for his entire force after a later defeat. All we know for certain is that he did indeed order decimation performed at some point during the Third Servile War. If it had been the latter situation, it is possible that up to 4,000 legionaries may have been put to death as a result. The reason for this action is reportedly that Crassus wanted his soldiers to view him as the greater threat as compared to Spartacus, to show that he was more dangerous to them than the enemy was. This would, in theory, encourage the soldiers to keep fighting, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Where the first engagement between Spartacus and Crassus occurred is another point where the narratives of Plutarch and Apianus diverge. The former claims that it happened at Picenum, while the latter states that it took place near Somnium. Whatever the case, Crassus deployed a force of 2 legions, under the command of his legate Mummius, instructing them to make their way around and flank Spartacus from behind, but not to engage. For whatever reason, Mummius disregarded the do not engage part of that command, and attacked Spartacus' forces, resulting in the 2 legions suffering an early avoidable defeat to the rebels. It was after this defeat that Crassus possibly ordered his men to perform decimation. Shortly after, Crassus led his men against Spartacus a second time, defeating him and killing roughly 6,000 of the rebels. More victories for Crassus followed in turn, and Spartacus' army was forced to retreat south through Lucania, to the Straits of Messina. Here, Spartacus arranged a deal with pirates to carry him and several thousand of his men to Sicilia, where they would work to encourage other slave uprisings and rebuild their forces. However, the pirates, being pirates, proved untrustworthy and betrayed Spartacus, taking his money and then abandoning him and his men. Spartacus attempted to have his men build rafts and boats to ferry themselves across the Straits of Messina, but this effort had to be abandoned when Crassus and his legions caught up with them. From the Straits of Messina, Spartacus led his forces toward Rhegium, or modern-day Reggio di Calabria, with Crassus in dogged pursuit. When Crassus arrived, he built fortifications across the isthmus, whilst under frequent attacks from the rebels, cutting off the rebels from their supply base and trapping them. At this time, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, known more commonly as Pompey the Great or simply Pompey, had returned to Italia victorious in his efforts against Quintus Sertorius in Hispania. It is unclear whether Crassus requested reinforcements, or if the statesmen in Rome simply saw an opportunity to throw even more of the Republic's might against Spartacus. Whatever the case, Pompey was ordered not to return to Rome, but to keep marching south and join Crassus in defeating the rebel uprising. They also sent further reinforcements under the command of the Macedonian proconsul Marcus Terentius Varro Lucullus. It is unlikely that Crassus requested aid from Pompey or Lucullus, as when he learned of their impending arrival, he moved his army into action, unwilling to let the credit for Spartacus' defeat be improperly attributed to any but himself. Spartacus attempted to negotiate with Crassus upon hearing of Pompey's approach, but Crassus refused to hear him out. Spartacus then led his army out of Rhegium, managing to break through the Roman fortifications. Crassus' army gave pursuit and managed to capture a group of rebels led by Gannicus and Castus, resulting in a loss of roughly 12,000 men. The Roman legions also suffered great losses, as the rebel army broke and splintered, with many turning from their leader to attack the pursuing Romans. Seeing this, Spartacus halted his retreat and ordered his entire force to attack Crassus' legions, making his final stand at the Battle of Silarius River. The battle ended in defeat for Spartacus and his rebels, with the majority of his army being killed. Most sources claim that Spartacus himself died in the battle, but his body was never found, leading some to speculate that he may have survived the battle and escaped from Rome. Whatever the case, the official record shows that Spartacus died in 71 BC, at the approximate age of 32 years old. In the aftermath of the battle, the surviving rebels were put to death, with about 6,000 of them being crucified along the Appian Way, stretching from Rome to Capua. The objectives of Spartacus's rebellion have been a matter of debate since it occurred. There is no evidence that Spartacus had any goals of trying to change Roman society or end slavery. There is also no evidence to support the claims of Appian and Florus that he intended to sack Rome itself. Plutarch believed that his goal was to cross the Alps and disperse his followers out into Europe so that they could all return to their homelands. However, he had the perfect opportunity to do exactly this after defeating the consular legions. However, instead of taking the clear path to freedom, he and his army turned southward to continue fighting. Spartacus has been portrayed into the modern era in literature, film, and television. The most famous of these is the 1951 novel Spartacus by Howard Fast, which was adapted into the 1960 film of the same name, directed by Stanley Kubrick and starring Kirk Douglas as Spartacus. The novel was also adapted into a 2004 miniseries starring Croatian actor Goran Višnjić. In 2010, a series premiered on the Starz network called Spartacus, starring the late Andy Whitfield as Spartacus and Manu Bennett as Crixus. Andy Whitfield was diagnosed with stage 4 non-Hodgkin lymphoma, forcing him to take what was meant to be a temporary break from filming to undergo treatment and recovery. During this time, the production filmed a prequel series focusing on Gannicus and Crixus. However, after being declared cancer-free 3 months after his diagnosis, during a routine checkup in September of 2010, it was discovered that Andy Whitfield had relapsed, forcing him to permanently step down from the role as Spartacus and seek a replacement. A replacement was found in the form of Liam McIntyre, who took over the role for the final 2 seasons of the show. Andy Whitfield died on September 11, 2011, after an 18-month battle with cancer. Spartacus, in one form or another, will live on forever in the hearts and minds of people all across the world, of every culture, creed, ethnicity, and political leaning, and I for one wholly believe that he has more than earned his place in the annals of history. Thank you all for watching. This has been an episode of Man Behind the Myth. Leave a like and a comment if the mood strikes you, and if any of you have suggestions for future videos, please feel free to leave them in the comments as well. Once again, I have been your host, Captain Crowseye, and God's willing, I'll see you all next time. Farewell.